Hi, and welcome to VerySpatialTV. This is Frank, and we're going to talk a little bit about ethics and geospatial on today's installment of Spatial Thoughts by Frank. Is this ethical? That's an interesting question. It's something I don't think we talk about or we ask a lot in the geospatial realm. Now, over my years, I've been involved in a lot of geospatial projects. I'm not going to admit on camera how many years of projects. It's a really big number. And I've rarely heard us ask that question, is this ethical? I can't say it's never happened in all my time. I don't actually write down all the questions and things that are asked in meetings. Is there coffee left? 127th time that was asked, this meeting. However, I think it's a question that almost begs an answer in its own right. So it's a yes or no question, right? It is ethical, it isn't ethical. I genuinely believe, maybe incorrectly, but I genuinely believe that most of us, most of the time, believe we behave in ethical ways. So what we're doing is ethical. So to ask the question, is this ethical? Most people, most of the time, are probably going to respond with yes, it is ethical. And I think part of the problem with that question is the flip side of that. Is this ethical? No, it isn't. Well, that means we're doing something bad, and we don't like to think we're doing something bad, so we tend to say, it is. Actually, what happens is we just don't even ask the question to start with. So I kind of think we need to reframe the question of ethics in the geospatial to not ask a question like, is this ethical? But to actually provide us with a working framework for ethical and how ethics work. Okay, so typically the way we think of ethics is we think of this one, right? So there's a train car coming down the tracks, and there's a baby on board, and there's a bunch of nuns tied up on a thing, and if you pull the lever one way, the baby dies. You pull the other way, the nuns die. What do? But here's the thing about that question. That's not actually ethics, that's morals, which is a different thing. They're related, certainly, but they are different. And I think part of the challenge that we have in asking the question, is this ethical, or even dealing with ethics in the geospatial, is that we tend to conflate the two a bit, and it gets very complicated because people's morals are their own. And certainly they may be slightly different in slightly different circumstances for slightly different reasons, and that's fine. But it doesn't mean that we can't all act ethically. Now, some of this harkens back to kind of the geospatial debates of like the 90s and the early 2000s, and what's moved into what's called critical GIS now within the academic realm. And the idea being that, is what you're doing, are you representing people? Are you including certain groups? Are you excluding certain groups? Why are you making the choices you're making? What are the implications of the choices you're making? And those questions were asked with very valid reasons early on within the creation of geospatial technology and GIS more specifically. And there's been a lot of attempts to sort of address that issue at some level. Now, for example, public participatory GIS is a great example of attempts to do that. Now, one of the challenges, though, with things like PPGIS is that it requires actually a lot of expert knowledge and time by the public to help answer the question of what you're doing. Am I representing people correctly? If I'm representing people well? And that's not an easy thing to do. People are busy. We all have stuff going on. Not only that, not only we're busy with our lives, we also most people don't have the basic expertise to understand some of the implications of the decisions they're making. Should I represent things as a raster? Should I represent things as a vector? These are geospatial technical problems that we can come up with good solutions for, but they may also have ethical implications. If I use a zip code to represent a group of people versus a census block, and are either of these appropriate for our particular use? Those have ethical implications, but they're technical questions, and the general public just doesn't have the necessary knowledge to reasonably answer that. So it comes back on us, the geospatial expert, to decide, is this ethical, or what we're doing ethical? And I think part of the challenge here is that we've not created a framework for understanding whether something is or isn't ethical. Now, part of the reason we haven't created a framework is because there are people who have done this a long time ago. Part of the reason we haven't done this is because it's really hard. It's difficult to decide whether something is ethical or not. It's not like, a spatial problem where we can ask the question, what percent of the population lives near a train station? I guess you could just Google it. How many people near a train station. Okay, you can't just Google it. The answer's just not there. That's a spatial problem. We get our data, right, from about trains or the rail network. We get our data about population. We can do a very simple spatial analysis and come up with an answer. So we can answer that question. To deal with the ethical questions of some of our geospatial queries and analyses, you can't just Google that and find an answer. You can't just go find a data set and interact with another data set and come up with a simple solution that answers the question. And that's very difficult. And the problem is that you've got to make ethical decisions at every step of the way. We're very comfortable with the notion that I go find my data over here, or I go generate my data here by collecting it or asking information. And then I use that data to help answer the spatial questions that I have by doing some analyses, and that's here. And then I create some products that users can use, whether that be an output in a numerical form, or a map, or interactive map, or an application, or whatever that may be. And then I give it to whoever the users are, whether that's somebody who has a very high degree of expertise asked a specific question, or the general public. And what we sort of assume is I do my data collection in an ethical way, and I do my analysis in an ethical way, and I do my cartographic output in an ethical way, and I present it to the user in an ethical way. And the assumption is if this and this and this and this are all ethical, then what I'm doing must be ethical. But is that true? And I don't know if it is. It's a question we don't really ask. And what's even worse, we don't really have the framework to how to analyze that sort of question. So we tend to focus on these little bits and say, how do I do this? And we kind of assume the little bits of each of these stages, the technical way of doing that is also the ethical way. And that's not always true. There's nothing inherent in a technical approach. Something that makes good sound technical sense makes it a good sound ethical sense. Great example that we're dealing with now is drones. I can use drone data to collect information about an area, but issues of privacy do arise, and we have to balance the ethical nature of, if I'm using this to help, say, emergency management, then is that more ethical or less ethical than collecting very private information about individuals? Now, as Jesse's mentioned many times in our podcast when we've talked about this, there are whole bodies of literature about ethics. There are people who study ethics for a living. But here's the complicated part. Those people don't tend to study geography and geospatial for a living too. So they don't really understand necessarily all the technical aspects necessary to combine with the ethical aspects to make a holistic way of viewing technology and geospatial and ethics. Normally that would be tasked for somebody who's just like a GIS person. And like I said, I've been in a lot of projects. Huge. I've been around a long time. And I don't think I've ever seen a geoethicist be on board. We've had cartographers and we've had database experts and we've had subject matter experts, but I don't think we've ever really had somebody who's a dedicated ethics person on board. So I don't think we tend to engage the question. And I genuinely believe this isn't something we are avoiding, that we don't want to do, but we don't want to answer. I just don't think we have a good understanding of how to come to grips with the question. We understand things like data models, and we understand things about limitations of information and what it can and can't tell. We understand limitations of analyses. That stuff is well defined and well documented, but we don't really understand ethics. And I think it's something that we need to develop within the geospatial context, a geospatial framework for how to attach ethics to data. Now, this is going to put everyone to sleep, and I'm sorry for it, but think of it like metadata. Metadata is very important to data, but you have to have them together. Data without metadata is problematic. What we need to do is we need to attach ethics to our processes. And I'm not sure how we go about doing that, but I think it's important that we start engaging that dialogue. So if you have any thoughts about how we can start engaging this sort of question, how we can infuse ethics into our geospatial processes, then please leave comments down below. I would love to hear them. If you found this video interesting, please like it. That helps us understand the videos that you find good and how we can change our content to meet your desires and what you're interested in hearing. If the video series is remotely interesting to you, please subscribe. It helps us with the YouTube folks and hopefully generate some, additional stuff to allow us to produce better content and go to more places. I'm Frank from VerySpatial, and these have just been some of my spatial thoughts. 77%. That was the answer. You got to dig around to find it.